The boy stood in a room that had once commanded the world. He was perhaps 16 years old, though the sources do not agree, and his name was a cruel accident of history, Romulus, after the founder, Augustulus, the little Augustus, a diminutive that mocked the very office he barely held. It was the year 476 by the Christian calendar, late summer, and the city of Ravenna lay quiet under a September sun. The imperial regalia rested before him, the purple cloak, the diadem, the ceremonial sword that generations of emperors had carried into battle and triumph. Across from him stood Odoacer, a Germanic warrior who had risen through the ranks of Rome's own armies, his face weathered by campaigns fought in service to an empire that was no longer his to serve. What passed between them in that room, whether words were exchanged, whether there was ceremony or only silence, the chroniclers do not record. They record only the outcome. The boy handed over the regalia. The German took them. And with that transaction, so quiet it barely registered in the contemporary sources, the Western Roman Empire ended. Yet this moment, for all its finality, explains nothing. It was not a beginning, but a terminus, the last station on a journey that had begun centuries before. To understand how Rome reached this room, this boy, this silent transfer of power, we must travel backward through time, to an era when such an ending would have seemed not merely unlikely, but inconceivable, when Rome was not a fading memory, but the living center of the known world. 3 centuries before Romulus Augustulus surrendered his empty title, Rome stood at the apex of human achievement. The year was 180 AD, and the empire stretched from the mist-shrouded hills of northern Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Mesopotamia, from the dense forests beyond the Rhine to the fertile valleys of the Nile. The Mediterranean Sea, which Romans called simply Mare Nostrum, our sea, was a Roman lake, its waters thick with trading vessels carrying grain from Egypt, olive oil from Hispania, wine from Gaul, and silk from the distant East. Along the empire's 60,000 miles of paved roads, legions marched in disciplined columns, couriers carried imperial dispatches, and merchants transported goods with a freedom of movement that the world would not see again for more than 1,000 years. This was the age of the 5 good emperors, a phrase coined by later historians, but capturing something real about this remarkable period. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, 5 men who ruled in succession not through blood inheritance, but through adoption, each choosing his successor based on merit rather than kinship. Under their governance, the empire achieved a stability and prosperity that seemed, to those who lived within it, to be the natural order of things. The historian Edward Gibbon would later write that if a man were asked to name the period in history during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would without hesitation name the age of the Antonines. This was not mere sentiment. The cities of the empire flourished with theaters, baths, forums, and temples. Roman law provided a framework of justice that applied, at least in principle, from the Scottish borderlands to the Syrian desert. The legions held the frontiers with professional competence, and the complex machinery of imperial administration, tax collectors, provincial governors, road engineers, aqueduct builders, hummed with the efficiency of long practice. To walk through Rome itself in this age was to experience the physical manifestation of power accumulated over 7 centuries. The Forum, where Cicero had once spoken and Caesar had been mourned, remained the symbolic heart of empire, its stones worn smooth by countless generations. The Colosseum, completed barely a century before, could seat 50,000 spectators for games that demonstrated Rome's mastery over man and beast alike. Aqueducts carried fresh water from distant hills into the city's fountains and baths, a feat of engineering that would not be matched for 1,500 years. And on the Palatine Hill, the imperial palace sprawled across acres of marble and mosaic, its corridors walked by emperors who commanded more territory and more subjects than any rulers before them. Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors, embodied both the heights and the hidden strains of this world. A philosopher by temperament, he spent much of his reign not in Rome, but in military camps along the Danube frontier, fighting wars he had not sought against Germanic tribes pressing steadily southward. In his tent at night, by lamplight, he wrote the Meditations, a private journal of Stoic philosophy that would outlast his empire by millennia. He understood, perhaps better than any emperor before him, the fragility that lay beneath Rome's magnificent surface. Of human life, he wrote, the time is a point, and the substance is in a flux. He died in March of 180, either in Vienna or near the town of Sirmium, worn down by plague and war and the weight of holding together a world that was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to strain at its foundations. What followed Marcus Aurelius was not immediate catastrophe. The empire did not collapse in a day or a decade, but his death marked the end of something that could not be recovered, an era of competent rule, stable succession, and confident expansion. His son, Commodus, the first blood heir to succeed in nearly a century, would prove disastrously unequal to the task of governance. The careful balance of the Antonine age would give way to military coups, civil wars, and economic crises that would transform the empire beyond recognition. The Rome that fell in 476 would not be the Rome of Marcus Aurelius, but something else entirely, a structure rebuilt so many times that even its inhabitants could no longer be certain what they were trying to preserve. The threads were about to pull loose. Marcus Aurelius was barely cold in his grave when the nature of his empire began to reveal itself. His son, Commodus, had accompanied him on the Danubian campaigns, had stood beside him in the military camps along the frontier where philosophy was written by lamplight, and Germanic warriors probed the frozen river crossings, seeking weakness. But where the father had seen duty, the son saw only burden. Commodus was 19 years old when he inherited absolute power over 60 million people, and he wanted none of it. Not the endless dispatches arriving from every corner of the empire, not the provincial governors seeking guidance, not the grinding responsibility of holding together a world that stretched beyond imagination. Within months of his father's death, he negotiated a hasty peace with the Germanic tribes and returned to Rome, abandoning the frontier wars his father had nearly won. The legions watched him go, and they remembered. What Commodus wanted was simpler and more dangerous than governance. He wanted adulation. He wanted spectacle. He wanted to be not an administrator of empire, but a living god, worshipped for his physical prowess rather than his political wisdom. He took to the arena himself, fighting as a gladiator in carefully staged combats where his opponents knew better than to win. He styled himself the Roman Hercules, had statues erected showing him draped in lion skin, club in hand. The senators who had counseled his father sat in the Colosseum's seats of honor and watched their emperor butcher ostriches and giraffes with arrows, performing for crowds who cheered because they feared what silence might bring. The purple that had once clothed philosopher kings now adorned a man who measured his worth in dead animals, staged victories, and purchased applause.
Yet Commodus, for all his grotesque excesses, was symptom rather than cause. His reign exposed what the competence of the Antonine emperors had obscured. The Roman system had no mechanism to prevent a bad emperor from ruling badly. There were no constitutional checks, no separation of powers, no process by which an unfit ruler could be lawfully removed. The Senate, theoretically the repository of republican tradition and senatorial wisdom, had long since been reduced to a ceremonial body that ratified what it could not resist. The Praetorian Guard, originally the emperor's household troops, had discovered that they could make and unmake rulers if sufficiently motivated or sufficiently paid. The legions on the distant frontiers understood that their swords were the true source of imperial authority. Power in Rome had always rested on force. The 5 good emperors had merely wielded that force with wisdom and restraint. Now the mask had slipped, and what lay beneath was not a constitutional order, but a military autocracy dependent entirely on the character of whoever wore the purple. The end came on the last night of the year 192. Commodus, increasingly paranoid and erratic, had announced plans to emerge on New Year's Day from the gladiatorial barracks dressed as a gladiator, inaugurating the new year as both consul and fighter. It was too much even for those who had tolerated his previous degradations of the office. His wrestling partner Narcissus strangled him in his bath on the orders of his chamberlain and the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. He was 31 years old, had ruled for 12 years, and left no legitimate heir. The Senate met in hasty session to declare him a public enemy and erase his name from monuments. They elevated an elderly senator named Pertinax to replace him, believing perhaps that the immediate crisis had passed and stability might yet return. Pertinax lasted 87 days. The Praetorian Guard, unsatisfied with the donative he offered upon his ascension, murdered him in the palace and did something unprecedented even by Roman standards. They auctioned the empire to the highest bidder. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus won the bidding, offering each guardsman 25,000 sesterces for his elevation. He entered the palace as Emperor of Rome, legitimate by no standard except that he had paid more than his competitors. The frontier legions received the news with contempt. 3 generals, Pescennius Niger in Syria, Claudius Albinus in Britain, and Septimus Severus on the Danube, each declared themselves the true emperor and marched on Rome. The year of 5 emperors had begun, and with it, civil war. Septimius Severus won because he was closest to Rome and because he was more ruthless than his rivals. A North African by birth, he had risen through the ranks on ability and understood that the empire's pretense of senatorial legitimacy was exactly that, a pretense. He defeated Niger in the east and Albinus in Gaul, executing both and proscribing their supporters. When he entered Rome in 193, he disbanded the Praetorian Guard that had murdered Pertinax and auctioned the throne, reconstituting it with legionaries loyal to himself. He raised military pay by 1/3, understanding that the soldiers who had made him could unmake him if unsatisfied. On his deathbed in 211, he would reportedly tell his sons to enrich the soldiers and despise everyone else. Whether or not he spoke these words, they captured the logic of his reign. The Severan settlement stabilized Rome for another generation, but the price was profound. The treasury strained under the weight of military salaries. The currency began its long debasement as emperors discovered that minting more coins with less silver offered a temporary solution to expenses that could not be met. The senatorial aristocracy, already marginalized, watched power flow irrevocably to the military professionals who commanded the legions. Most significantly, the succession remained unsettled. Severus could pass power to his sons, but he could not guarantee they would pass it peacefully to theirs. When the last Severan emperor fell to assassination in 335, the system Severus had constructed would prove unable to manage what followed. The crisis he had temporarily resolved had only been deferred, and the measures he used to resolve it had made the next crisis worse. The murder of the last Severan emperor in 335 opened a wound that would bleed for 50 years. Maximinus Thrax, the Thracian soldier who ordered the killing, was the first emperor who had never set foot in Rome, a giant of a man who had risen from the peasantry through sheer physical prowess and military competence. He understood legions but not governance, understood violence but not the delicate web of patronage and legitimacy that held the empire together. Within 3 years, he too was dead, murdered by his own troops during a failed siege in northern Italy. The pattern was established. Between 235 and 284, over 50 men would claim the imperial title. The average reign lasted less than 3 years. The overwhelming majority ended not in peaceful succession, but in assassination, battlefield defeat, or execution by rivals. The purple that had once represented the culmination of Roman ambition became a death sentence worn by desperate men. The sources from this period are fragmentary and often contradictory, the administrative machinery that had once recorded imperial decisions breaking down alongside everything else. What emerges from the scattered accounts is an empire devouring itself. Generals elevated by their troops marched against other generals elevated by other troops. Cities that had stood open for centuries hastily constructed defensive walls with whatever materials lay at hand, including stones torn from temples and monuments. The great highways that had carried trade and legions now carried armies fighting each other while the frontiers they should have defended lay exposed. Along the Rhine and Danube, Germanic confederations pressed southward with increasing confidence, sensing the weakness within. The Alemanni raided into Italy itself. The Goths descended into the Balkans and sacked cities that had known peace for generations. In the east, the Sassanid Persian Empire, Rome's most sophisticated rival, launched devastating invasions that culminated in 260 with the unthinkable. The Emperor Valerian was captured in battle at Edessa and spent the remainder of his life as a Persian trophy, reportedly used as a human footstool when the Sassanid king mounted his horse. The economy, strained for generations by military spending, collapsed into chaos. The silver content of the denarius, Rome's standard currency, had been gradually reduced since the Severan dynasty. Now it plummeted to almost nothing, the coins becoming thin discs of bronze washed with silver that fooled no one. Prices spiraled beyond comprehension. Merchants who had once accepted imperial currency demanded payment in goods or older coins of known purity. The complex trade networks that had bound the empire together began to fragment as confidence in money itself evaporated. Landowners retreated to self-sufficient estates. Cities shrank as urban economies dependent on trade withered. The tax base contracted precisely when military expenses were at their peak, forcing each successive emperor to debase the currency further and accelerate the spiral. Into this economic and political catastrophe came plague. Beginning around 249, an epidemic swept across the empire with devastating force. The contemporary sources call it the Plague of Cyprian, after the Christian bishop who described its horrors in Carthage. The symptoms suggest something like smallpox or a hemorrhagic theater, violent intestinal disturbance, ulceration of the throat, gangrene of the extremities, blindness among survivors. At its height, according to later accounts that may exaggerate but capture the psychological reality, 5,000 people died daily in Rome alone. The plague burned through the legions that were supposed to defend the frontiers and fight the civil wars. It emptied the villages that supplied both soldiers and agricultural labor. It killed at least one emperor, Hostilian, and possibly another, Claudius Gothicus. For 15 years it returned in waves, each resurgence weakening what the previous outbreak had left diminished. By 260, the empire that Marcus Aurelius had ruled as a unified whole existed only in theory. In the West, Postumus, a general of Gallic origin, established what historians call the Gallic Empire, Britain, Gaul, and parts of Hispania breaking away under their own line of emperors who maintained Roman forms while acknowledging no authority in Rome. In the East, after Valerian's capture left a power vacuum, the city of Palmyra, under its remarkable queen Zenobia, expanded to control Egypt, Syria, and much of Asia Minor. The rump, centered on Italy and fragments of the Balkans and North Africa, was all that remained of what had been the greatest empire on earth. 3 Roman emperors now issued coins, commanded legions, and claimed universal sovereignty. The unification that Augustus had imposed 3 centuries earlier seemed to have been an aberration that circumstances had finally corrected.
Yet Rome did not die in the 3rd century. From the chaos emerged a succession of soldier emperors, hard men from the Danubian provinces who understood that survival required both military victory and institutional reform. Claudius Gothicus defeated the Goths so thoroughly at Nisus in 269 that they would not threaten the empire again for a century. Aurelian, perhaps the most capable of all, reconquered the Palmyrene and Gallic empires in a series of lightning campaigns, reunifying the empire through sheer force of will. He also built the massive defensive walls around Rome that still stand today, an acknowledgement that the city, which had not needed walls for 5 centuries, could no longer take its safety for granted. These emperors stabilized the frontiers, restored something resembling central authority, and demonstrated that the imperial structure could survive shocks that would have destroyed lesser polities. The cost of survival was transformation. The empire that emerged from the crisis was not the empire that had entered it. The old senatorial aristocracy that had provided a veneer of republican legitimacy was marginalized beyond recovery. The army had become the sole source of political authority, its loyalty purchased at ever-increasing price. The economy had been shattered and would require generations to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. The cities had contracted, the population had declined, and the confidence that had once characterized Roman civilization had been replaced by something grimmer and more defensive. When Diocletian rose to power in 284, he inherited not the prosperous empire of Marcus Aurelius, but a traumatized survivor. His response would reshape what Rome meant forever. Diocletian came from nothing, or as close to nothing as the Roman world allowed. Born in Dalmatia around 244, possibly the son of a freed slave, he rose through the ranks of the army during the desperate decades when military competence was the only path to survival and the only qualification for power. He had watched emperors made and unmade with brutal regularity, had seen the empire fragment and reassemble through violence, had understood from personal experience that the old system could not hold. When he seized power in 284, after yet another assassination removed yet another short-lived ruler, he was not interested in restoration. He had no nostalgia for the principate of Augustus or the philosophical governance of Marcus Aurelius. Those models had failed. What Diocletian proposed was something unprecedented, a complete restructuring of how Rome governed itself, designed not for glory, but for survival. The Tetrarchy was his most radical innovation, and it addressed directly the problem that had produced 50 years of chaos.
One emperor could not defend every frontier simultaneously, and the succession of a single ruler inevitably invited assassination and civil war. Diocletian's solution was to divide both power and territory among 4 men. 2 senior emperors, titled Augusti, would rule the eastern and western halves of the empire. Each Augustus would adopt a junior emperor, titled Caesar, who would serve as lieutenant, heir apparent, and successor. When an Augustus died or retired, his Caesar would step into his place and appoint a new Caesar in turn. The system was designed to eliminate the uncertainty that had made the purple a death sentence, replacing contested succession with orderly transition and distributing the military burden across 4 capable commanders. Diocletian took the eastern Augustus position for himself, establishing his capital not in Rome but in Nicomedia, a city in Asia Minor closer to the Persian frontier that demanded constant attention. His trusted colleague Maximian became Augustus of the West, ruling from Milan and later Trier, cities positioned to respond to threats along the Rhine and Danube. 2 younger officers, Galerius and Constantius, became the Caesars. Rome itself, the ancient capital, became ceremonially significant but strategically irrelevant, too far from any frontier to serve as an effective command center. The empire would henceforth be governed from wherever the emperors needed to be, which meant fortress cities near the borders where danger was immediate and constant. The administrative apparatus expanded enormously to match this new structure. Diocletian roughly doubled the number of provinces, breaking the larger units into smaller ones that individual governors could control more tightly and that could not serve as power bases for ambitious rivals. He separated civil and military authority so that provincial governors no longer commanded troops and military commanders no longer collected taxes. The bureaucracy swelled to manage this complexity, staffed increasingly by professional administrators rather than senatorial aristocrats serving rotations of public duty. The tax system was reformed to extract revenue more efficiently from a diminished population, with assessments based on land and labor that tied peasants to their fields more firmly than before. The state reached deeper into daily life than the Principate had ever attempted, regulating and recording and demanding in ways that earlier generations would have found intolerable. The economy received equally drastic intervention. In 301, Diocletian issued his famous Edict on Maximum Prices, an extraordinary attempt to halt inflation by simply decreeing what things could cost. The edict listed hundreds of goods and services with their maximum legal prices: wheat, barley, wine, oil, meat, fish, vegetables, clothing, transportation, wages for every conceivable occupation from farm laborer to wall painter to legal advocate. The penalties for violation were severe, including death. The edict was a confession of desperation, an acknowledgement that the currency was so debased and confidence so shattered that only state coercion could impose order on exchange. It largely failed. Goods disappeared from markets rather than being sold at mandated prices. Enforcement proved impossible across an empire of 60 million people, but the attempt revealed the mindset of the new regime. Problems would be solved by command, by regulation, by the visible hand of imperial authority, rather than the invisible workings of commerce and custom.
The religious dimension of Diocletian's rule pointed towards the same authoritarian logic. He elevated imperial ceremony to unprecedented heights of elaborate ritual, surrounding himself with the trappings of divine monarchy borrowed from Persian and Hellenistic traditions. Subjects who approached the emperor prostrated themselves in full proskynesis, a practice that would have struck earlier Romans as oriental despotism incompatible with their traditions. Diocletian titled himself Jovius, associate of Jupiter, while Maximian became Herculeus, associate of Hercules.
The emperors were no longer first among citizens, but gods walking among mortals, separated from ordinary humanity by walls of protocol and sacred mystery. This, too, was calculated. If the emperor was divine, his authority was beyond question, and the endless cycle of assassination and usurpation might finally be broken. For 20 years the system worked. The frontiers held, the civil wars ceased, the economy stabilized, if not recovered. Diocletian and his colleagues defeated Persian invasions, suppressed usurpers, and restored something resembling order to a world that had nearly dissolved into chaos. Then, in 305, Diocletian did something no Roman emperor had ever done voluntarily. He retired. Citing ill health, he abdicated his position and withdrew to an enormous palace he had built at Spalatum on the Dalmatian coast, where he reportedly spent his remaining years growing vegetables. He compelled the reluctant Maximian to retire alongside him. The Caesars Galerius and Constantius stepped up to become Augusti. New Caesars were appointed. The system functioned exactly as designed. It functioned for exactly 1 year. Constantius died in 306, and his soldiers, ignoring the tetrarchic principle entirely, acclaimed his son Constantine as Augustus. Within months, Maxentius's son Maxentius seized power in Rome. The retired Maximian returned to politics. Galerius appointed rival claimants. By 308, there were 6 men claiming to be Augustus simultaneously. The Tetrarchy collapsed into the same civil wars it had been designed to prevent, wars that would rage for nearly 2 decades before a single victor emerged. Diocletian's system required trust and self-abnegation among ambitious men, qualities in permanent short supply. The structure he built survived him. The harmony it required did not. The collapse of Diocletian's tetrarchy produced 2 decades of intermittent civil war, a grim echo of the 3rd century chaos that the system had been designed to prevent. Armies marched against armies, emperors rose and fell, and the frontiers once again suffered from the empire's inability to present a unified defense. From this renewed bloodletting emerged a single figure who would transform Rome more profoundly than any ruler since Augustus. Constantine was the son of Constantius, the Caesar who had become Augustus of the West under Diocletian's arrangement. When Constantius died in York in 306, his soldiers did what Roman soldiers had done for generations. They proclaimed his son emperor, ignoring the tetrarchic principle that should have elevated someone else entirely. Constantine was perhaps 32 years old, experienced in war, and possessed of an ambition that would accept no limits short of sole rule over the entire Roman world. The path to that sole rule led through the Battle of the Milvian Bridge on October 28, 312. Constantine had marched south from Gaul to challenge Maxentius, who held Rome and claimed the Western Empire as his own. The sources disagree about what happened before the battle, but later tradition crystallized around a vision. Constantine saw a cross of light in the sky, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint the Chi Rho symbol, the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek, on their shields. Whether the vision was genuine religious experience, calculated political gesture, or retrospective invention, the battle itself was real enough. Maxentius led his forces out of Rome's walls to fight on the north bank of the Tiber, where a temporary bridge supplemented the ancient stone crossing. The battle turned into a rout. Maxentius drowned in the river, weighed down by his armor, and Constantine entered Rome as its undisputed master. He attributed his victory to the Christian God. The significance of this attribution cannot be overstated. Christianity in 312 was a minority religion, perhaps 10% of the empire's population, concentrated in the eastern cities and among the lower classes. It had endured waves of persecution, most recently under Diocletian himself, whose edicts had ordered churches destroyed, scriptures burned, and clergy arrested. Christians had died in arenas, in prisons, in mines. They had also survived, their communities bound together by shared suffering and a faith that promised eternal reward for earthly endurance. Constantine's embrace of this persecuted sect began the transformation of both Christianity and the empire. The Edict of Milan in 313 granted Christians legal toleration throughout the empire. Imperial patronage followed, churches built at state expense, clergy exempted from civic obligations, Christian symbols appearing on imperial coinage. Within a generation, the religion of the crucified Jewish teacher had become the religion of the Roman emperor. Constantine involved himself in Christian affairs with an intensity that surprised and sometimes alarmed church leaders. When theological disputes threatened to fracture the Christian community, he intervened as though ecclesiastical unity were a matter of state security, which, in his understanding, it was. The Council of Nicaea in 325, convened by imperial command and presided over by the emperor himself, attempted to resolve the Arian controversy over the nature of Christ's divinity. 300 bishops gathered in a palace on the shore of a Turkish lake, debating questions of theology, while the ruler of the Roman world watched and occasionally participated. The creed they produced, declaring Christ of one substance with the Father, became the foundation of Christian orthodoxy. But the controversy did not end with the council. Theological disputes would consume Christian intellectual life for centuries, and emperors after Constantine would find themselves drawn ever deeper into arguments they barely understood, backing one faction and then another, exiling bishops and recalling them, making eternal questions of divine nature into immediate questions of political loyalty. The other great transformation of Constantine's reign was geographic. In 324, having defeated his last rival, Licinius, Constantine began construction of a new capital on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, at the point where Europe and Asia nearly touch across the narrow waters of the Bosphorus. Constantinople, the city of Constantine, was designed from the start as a Christian capital, free from the pagan associations that clung to Rome's temples and traditions. It was also positioned with strategic brilliance.
The site commanded the crossing between two continents and the passage between two seas. Its peninsula was defensible, as Rome was not, protected on 3 sides by water and on the 4th by massive walls. It lay closer to the Persian frontier that demanded constant attention, and closer to the wealthy provinces of Egypt and Syria that supplied the empire's revenue. Rome had built its empire from the city on the Tiber. Constantine now acknowledged that the empire's center of gravity had shifted irrevocably eastward. The dedication of Constantinople in 330 marked a division that would deepen over the following centuries. The western and eastern halves of the empire, nominally unified under a single imperial system, increasingly developed distinct characters. The west was poorer, more rural, more dependent on the large estates of the senatorial aristocracy. The east was wealthier, more urbanized, more bureaucratically sophisticated. The west faced Germanic peoples pressing across the Rhine and Danube. The east faced Persia, a formidable rival, but one that sought territorial adjustment rather than civilizational destruction. Greek dominated Eastern discourse, while Latin remained the language of Western administration. These differences had existed before Constantine, but his foundation of a second imperial capital gave them institutional expression.
2 courts, 2 bureaucracies, 2 senates now existed, and though emperors would continue to rule jointly and occasionally reunify the empire under a single hand, the logic of division had been inscribed into the imperial structure. Constantine died in 337, baptized on his deathbed, as was common for converts uncertain they could maintain Christian virtue throughout a life of political violence. He left behind an empire transformed, Christian in official religion, Eastern in its new center of gravity, autocratic in governance, and divided in ways that administrative convenience had made structural reality. His sons immediately began fighting among themselves for supremacy. The pattern of civil war that Constantine had seemingly ended resumed as though it had never paused. Yet the changes he had initiated proved permanent in ways that the political arrangements did not. The empire would fragment and reunify repeatedly in the coming century. Christianity and Constantinople would endure. The chaos that followed Constantine's death consumed his dynasty within 3 decades. His sons murdered each other and their cousins in struggles for supremacy. Julian, the last survivor of the family, died on campaign against Persia in 363, and with him ended the Constantinian line. The armies in the east elevated Jovian, an officer of no particular distinction, who lasted 8 months before dying of accidental carbon monoxide poisoning in his sleeping quarters. From this unpromising situation emerged the last generation of genuinely capable emperors the Western Empire would produce. Valentinian I, elevated by the army in 364, understood immediately that the empire was too vast and too beset by threats for one man to govern. He chose his brother Valens as co-emperor, assigned him the east, and took the west for himself. For the next 11 years, the brothers would hold the frontiers through competence, energy, and an unflinching willingness to use violence against any threat, internal or external. Valentinian was a soldier's emperor in the old mold, a man of physical courage and a volcanic temper, who spent his reign in perpetual motion along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. He built fortifications, conducted punitive expeditions across the rivers, and maintained discipline through a severity that sometimes crossed into cruelty. The sources record him keeping 2 man-eating bears near his bedroom, named Golden Fleck and Innocence, to whom he occasionally fed subordinates who displeased him. Whether literally true or not, the story captures something real about his reign, a brutality that was also effectiveness, a harshness that kept the frontiers intact. He died in 375 during an audience with envoys from a Germanic tribe, apparently suffering a stroke brought on by rage at their insolent demands. His death at 54 from natural causes was almost anomalous for a Roman emperor. His son, Gratian, a teenager, inherited the Western throne. The Germanic peoples pressing against Roman frontiers in this era were not the disorganized raiders of earlier centuries. The Goths, Vandals, Burgundians, and Franks had grown larger, more cohesive, and more sophisticated through generations of contact with Rome. They had served in Roman armies, observed Roman tactics, and acquired Roman weapons. Their leaders understood imperial politics and exploited imperial divisions. They were also increasingly fleeing something worse. Far to the east, on the steppes beyond the Black Sea, a nomadic people called the Huns had begun a westward migration that would reshape the entire Germanic world. The Huns were horse archers of terrifying effectiveness, capable of campaigns across distances that seemed impossible to sedentary peoples. As they moved west, they displaced the peoples in their path, who displaced those further west in turn. The pressure building on Rome's frontiers was not simply Germanic ambition, it was a chain reaction of displacement extending thousands of miles into the Asian interior. Rome had always managed frontier peoples through a combination of military defeat and strategic incorporation. Tribes that threatened the empire were crushed in battle. Their survivors were settled on Roman land, given time to assimilate, and eventually recruited into Roman armies. This system had worked for centuries, converting potential enemies into defenders of the very frontiers they had once threatened. But the scale of movement in the late 4th century strained this model beyond recognition. The peoples arriving at Roman borders were no longer small bands seeking land. They were entire nations, tens of thousands of warriors with their families and livestock, seeking not mere settlement, but survival. The empire could not defeat them all in battle, could not absorb them all into its territory, could not feed them all while they waited for land assignments. The gap between what Rome needed to do and what Rome could do widened with each passing year. The Gothic crisis that would culminate at Adrianople began as an attempt to apply the old model to new circumstances. In 376, a vast number of Gothic refugees arrived at the Danube, fleeing the Hunnic advance, and begged permission to cross into Roman territory. Valens, still ruling in the east, saw opportunity. These Goths could become soldiers, farmers, taxpayers, filling gaps in an empire whose population had never recovered from the 3rd century plagues. He granted them permission to cross. But the system that should have received them, the bureaucracy that should have fed them, settled them, and integrated them, failed catastrophically. Corrupt officials stole the supplies meant for the refugees and sold them dog meat at extortionate prices. The Goths, starving and humiliated, revolted. 2 years of increasingly desperate warfare followed as Roman forces attempted to suppress an armed people embedded within Roman territory with no means of retreat and nothing left to lose.
Theodosius, who rose to power after the catastrophe of 378, managed the Gothic problem through accommodation rather than victory. The settlement of 382 granted the Goths unprecedented terms. They would live within the empire as federated people under their own leaders, providing military service in exchange for subsidies and land. They were not dissolved into the Roman population as earlier settled peoples had been. They remained distinct, armed, and autonomous. The arrangement worked while Theodosius lived to manage it. He was the last emperor to rule both halves of the empire, reunifying them briefly after civil wars in 388 and 394. His presence held together an increasingly unstable system through personal authority and military credibility. Theodosius died in Milan in January 395, aged only 48, leaving the empire to his 2 sons. Arcadius, 18 years old, received the east, and Honorius, 10 years old, received the west. Neither possessed anything resembling their father's capability. The division that followed was meant to be administrative, a continuation of the partnership that had governed the empire since Diocletian. In practice, it became permanent. The 2 courts developed separate policies, separate interests, and separate fates. Honorius would rule from Ravenna, a city chosen for its marshes and its access to the sea, defensible in ways Milan was not. Rome itself faded into ceremonial irrelevance. The Goths settled within the empire remained unassimilated, their kings watching for opportunity, their warriors remembering promises made and broken. The Huns came out of the eastern steppes like a force of nature, and the peoples in their path fled or were destroyed.
No one in the Roman world knew where the Huns originated or what drove their westward migration. The Gothic historian Jordanes, writing a century and a half later, would claim they were the offspring of witches and evil spirits, so alien did they seem to the settled peoples of Europe. They fought from horseback with composite bows of terrifying power, loosing arrows at full gallop with accuracy that seemed supernatural. They lived in the saddle, ate raw meat softened beneath their thighs, and showed no interest in cities or cultivation. When they descended upon the Gothic kingdoms north of the Black Sea in the early 370s, the Goths faced a simple choice: fight and die, submit and serve, or flee. Tens of thousands chose to flee, and the only direction open to them was south, toward the Danube, toward Rome. In the summer of 376, an enormous mass of Gothic refugees gathered on the northern bank of the Danube and sent emissaries across the river to beg sanctuary. The sources suggest perhaps 200,000 people, though ancient numbers are notoriously unreliable. What matters is that this was not a raiding party, but an entire nation in motion, warriors and families and livestock and whatever possessions they had managed to carry in their flight. Valens, the Eastern emperor, was far away in Antioch, preparing for a campaign against Persia. His officials on the Danube frontier faced an impossible situation. They lacked the military strength to prevent the crossing if the Goths forced it. They also saw opportunity. These refugees could become soldiers and farmers, filling the gaps in an empire perpetually short of manpower. Permission was granted. The Goths crossed the Danube into Roman territory, and the catastrophe that would destroy an army and transform an empire began. The system that should have received these refugees failed at every level. Roman officials charged with providing food and arranging settlement instead saw opportunities for profit. They withheld the grain that should have fed the starving Goths and sold it back to them at extortionate prices. When the refugees ran out of money, the officials accepted their children as slaves in exchange for dog meat. The Goths, who had crossed the Danube expecting Roman protection, found themselves concentrated in holding areas without adequate supplies, their weapons confiscated, their families starving, their children sold into bondage. They had escaped the Huns only to discover that Rome could be equally merciless. By 377, the situation had become unsustainable. Gothic leaders who had counseled patience lost authority to those who demanded action. The revolt that followed was not unprovoked aggression, but the inevitable consequence of systematic abuse. The Roman response was fragmented and ineffective. Local commanders attempted to suppress the uprising with inadequate forces and suffered repeated defeats. The Goths, now rearmed with weapons taken from fallen Roman soldiers, rampaged through Thrace, gathering strength as they moved. Other Gothic groups that had crossed the Danube separately joined the rebellion. Runaway slaves and desperate peasants swelled their ranks. By the summer of 378, the Goths had devastated the Balkans and showed no sign of exhaustion. Valens, his Persian campaign suspended, marched west from Antioch with the Eastern Field Army to crush what he still believed was a manageable revolt. His nephew, Gratian, the Western emperor, was bringing reinforcements from Gaul, but Valens did not wait. The sources suggest he was jealous of sharing the victory, eager to demonstrate that he needed no help from his young co-ruler. On August 9th, 378, outside the city of Adrianople, he led approximately 15,000 Roman soldiers against a Gothic force of unknown but substantial size. The Romans approached the Gothic wagon circle in the early afternoon after a long march under the August sun without adequate water. The infantry had not eaten. The cavalry was still deploying. Valens had received reports that the Gothic warriors numbered only 10,000, a force his army could destroy. The reports were wrong, or incomplete, or deliberately falsified. The Gothic cavalry, thousands of warriors who had been foraging in the surrounding countryside, returned to the battlefield just as the Roman assault began. They struck the Roman right flank with devastating force. The Roman cavalry broke and fled. The infantry, compressed into an ever-tightening space, lost the room to wield their weapons effectively. Men could not raise their arms to swing their swords. Shields pressed against shields until soldiers suffocated standing upright. The Goths closed in from all sides, methodically slaughtering an army that could no longer fight back.
Valens fell somewhere on that field. No one saw him die. One account suggests he was carried to a nearby farmhouse, wounded by an arrow, and burned alive when the Goths set the building aflame without knowing the emperor was inside. Another claims he was struck down in the press of bodies and trampled beyond recognition. His body was never recovered, never given the burial rites that Roman tradition demanded. 2/3 of the Eastern Field Army died with him. Experienced soldiers, veteran officers, military knowledge accumulated over generations, all destroyed in a single afternoon. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who may have served in the campaign and certainly knew men who did, compared the disaster to Cannae, where Hannibal had annihilated a Roman army 6 centuries before. But Rome had recovered from Cannae. What followed Adrianople was different. The Goths could not be expelled. The empire lacked the military strength to defeat them after the catastrophic losses of August 378. They could not be ignored. They remained an armed nation within Roman territory, capable of devastating whatever region they chose to plunder. The settlement that Theodosius eventually negotiated in 382 acknowledged this reality. The Goths would live within the empire as autonomous federates under their own leaders, providing military service when called upon, but otherwise governing themselves. They were not subjects of Rome. They were armed guests who could not be made to leave. For the first time in Roman history, a barbarian people existed permanently within the imperial boundaries as a distinct and independent force. The precedent would prove fatal. Within a generation, other peoples would demand similar arrangements, and the empire would lack the strength to refuse them. Alaric had spent his entire adult life seeking a place within the Roman system, and the Roman system had spent those same decades refusing to grant him one. He was born around 370, likely within the empire's borders, part of the Gothic nation that had crossed the Danube as refugees and remained as autonomous federates after Adrianople. He grew up Roman in many ways, familiar with Latin, educated in imperial politics, understanding the intricate dance of court factions and military commands that determined who held power and who did not. He had fought for Rome under Theodosius, leading Gothic contingents in the civil war of 394 that restored the empire's unity. He had expected recognition, advancement, integration into the Roman military hierarchy that would legitimize his position and provide for his people. What he received instead was dismissal, suspicion, and the clear message that Gothic warriors were useful, but Gothic leaders would never be trusted. The division of the empire after Theodosius's death in 495 created the conditions for Alaric's transformation from frustrated federates commander to existential threat. The Eastern court under Arcadius and the Western court under Honorius pursued separate and often contradictory policies, each willing to redirect Gothic aggression toward the other half of the empire rather than address the underlying problem. Alaric ravaged Greece in 396 and 397, sacking cities that had not seen warfare in generations, and the Eastern government responded by making him master of soldiers in Illyricum, a legitimate Roman command that gave official sanction to his armed following.
The Western government, outraged, denounced the appointment, but lacked the strength to reverse it. Alaric had discovered the truth about late Roman power. The empire could be played against itself, its divisions exploited by anyone ruthless and patient enough to probe for weakness. The one man who consistently checked Alaric's ambitions was Stilicho, the Western generalissimo who effectively ruled in the name of the young emperor Honorius. Stilicho was himself half Vandal, the son of a barbarian cavalry officer who had risen through imperial service, and he understood the Gothic threat because he understood Gothic capabilities from the inside. Twice in the first years of the 5th century, he cornered Alaric's forces in positions where destruction seemed inevitable. Twice political complications allowed the Gothic king to escape. The Eastern government worked against Stilicho as actively as it worked against Alaric, seeing both as threats to its interests. The Western court, dominated by factions jealous of Stilicho's power, whispered that his failure to destroy the Goths was not incompetence but collusion. For a decade, Stilicho maintained a precarious balance, holding the western frontier with inadequate resources while managing an emperor who lacked the capacity for independent judgment and a court consumed by intrigue. The balance collapsed in 408. Stilicho's enemies at court convinced Honorius that his generalissimo was planning treason, perhaps intending to place his own son on the throne. The emperor ordered his arrest. The general, who commanded enough loyal troops to resist, chose instead to take sanctuary in a church at Ravenna, perhaps believing that his years of service would protect him, perhaps unwilling to ignite another civil war. It did not matter. Imperial agents dragged him from sanctuary and executed him. In the purge that followed, thousands of barbarian soldiers serving in the Roman army, men who had fought for Rome for years, whose families lived in Italian towns, were massacred by mobs with government encouragement. The survivors, perhaps 30,000 warriors, fled to the one leader who could protect them. They found Alaric, and they demanded revenge. Alaric's first siege of Rome began in late 408. His armies surrounded the city and blocked the Tiber, cutting off the grain supply from Ostia that fed Rome's population. The city that had once commanded the world now contained perhaps 400,000 people, most of them dependent on imported food that could no longer arrive. Hunger turned to famine. The price of provisions soared beyond what ordinary citizens could pay. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. The Senate negotiated desperately, offering enormous payments of gold and silver and pepper to purchase Alaric's withdrawal. He accepted and retreated, but his fundamental demand remained unmet. He wanted land for his people to settle, an official position within the Roman military hierarchy, and recognition as a legitimate part of the imperial system rather than an enemy to be bought off or destroyed. Honorius, safe behind the marshes of Ravenna, refused to negotiate meaningfully. Alaric besieged Rome again in 409, briefly elevating a puppet emperor before abandoning the pretense. Honorius still would not treat. In August 410, Alaric besieged Rome for the third time. The Salarian Gate opened on the night of August 24th, whether through treachery or assault, the sources do not agree. For the first time in 800 years, a foreign army entered the city that had conquered the Mediterranean world. The sack lasted 3 days. Alaric, a Christian of the Arian variety, ordered churches designated as sanctuaries where those who reached them would be spared. Much of the population survived. The Gothic warriors sought plunder rather than massacre. Gold, silver, silk, the accumulated treasures of centuries were parried away. The palaces of the aristocracy were stripped. ancient monuments were left standing but emptied of whatever portable wealth they contained. By the standards of ancient warfare, the sack was almost restrained, but the symbolic devastation transcended any material accounting. Rome had fallen. The city that called itself eternal, the center from which law and order had radiated across the known world, had been violated by the very peoples it had once dismissed as barbarians. The shock reverberated across the Mediterranean. In Bethlehem, the scholar Jerome wept and found himself unable to continue his commentary on Ezekiel. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken, he wrote, his grief raw on the page. In Hippo, the bishop Augustine began composing a massive theological response to pagans who blamed Rome's fall on its abandonment of the old gods. The city of God would take 13 years to complete, a sustained argument that earthly cities rise and fall, but the true city of the faithful endures beyond all temporal catastrophe. These intellectual responses captured something essential about what Rome's fall meant, not merely a military defeat, but a crisis of meaning, a rupture in assumptions about civilization and permanence that had structured thought for generations. Alaric did not long survive his triumph. He led his people south through Italy, intending to cross to North Africa and its grain-rich provinces. Storms destroyed his ships. Fever took his life at Cosenza in late 410. His followers diverted a river, buried their king in its bed with his treasures, then returned the waters to their course and killed the slaves who had dug the grave so that no one would ever find it. The Goths wandered on under new leadership, eventually settling in southern Gaul and Spain, where they would establish kingdoms that lasted for centuries. Rome itself recovered, its population diminished, its confidence shattered, but its walls still standing. The empire continued. But the myth of Roman invincibility, the assumption that Rome represented an order beyond challenge, had died in those 3 August days and would not be resurrected.
The sack of 410 had proven that Rome could fall. The decades that followed proved that it could not stop falling. What had seemed like a singular catastrophe revealed itself as the opening of a floodgate, each breach in the frontier widening the ones that followed, each territory lost, reducing the empire's capacity to defend what remained. The Western Empire after Alaric was a structure consuming itself, its armies shrinking, its revenues contracting, its emperors receding into irrelevance, while military strongmen of increasingly barbarian origin managed what could no longer be governed. The wolves were gathering, and the shepherd had grown too weak to drive them away. The Vandals had crossed the frozen Rhine on the last day of 406, part of a mass movement of peoples that shattered the Gallic frontier while Stilicho focused on containing Alaric in Italy. They carved a path of destruction through Gaul, crossed the Pyrenees into Spain, and spent 2 decades fighting the Visigoths, the Romans, and each other for control of the Iberian Peninsula. By 429, pressed by Visigothic expansion, they made the crossing that would prove most consequential of all. Under their king, Gaiseric, perhaps 80,000 Vandals, warriors, families, elderly, children, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa. Within a decade, they had conquered the wealthiest provinces of the Western Empire, the grain lands that fed Rome itself, the tax revenues that paid the armies that might have stopped them. Carthage fell in 439, and with it fell any realistic hope of Western recovery. The loss of North Africa was not merely territorial, it was arterial. The grain ships that had sailed from Carthage to Ostia for 5 centuries stopped sailing. Rome's population, already diminished by the events of 410, contracted further as the food supply that had sustained millions disappeared.
The treasury that had drawn taxes from African estates found those revenues redirected to Vandal coffers. The Western Empire had lost perhaps half its remaining tax base in a single decade, and the Vandal fleet now dominated the Western Mediterranean, raiding coastal cities at will. Gaiseric would rule for another 50 years, outliving every Roman emperor who tried to dislodge him, defeating every expedition sent against his African kingdom. He understood that he had seized not merely land, but leverage, and he used it with ruthless intelligence. Gaul fragmented into competing zones of control. The Visigoths, settling after their long wandering from the Balkans through Italy and into southern Gaul, established a kingdom centered on Toulouse that the imperial government formally recognized in 418. They were theoretically federates, allies providing military service in exchange for land and subsidy, but the distinction between federate settlement and independent kingdom grew increasingly theoretical with each passing year. The Burgundians expanded in the Rhone Valley under similar arrangements, another armed nation within nominal imperial territory, governing itself by its own laws. The Franks expanded in the north, not through dramatic conquest, but through steady absorption of land the empire could no longer defend. Roman aristocrats in these regions adapted to new realities, learning to work with barbarian kings as they had once worked with imperial governors, preserving what culture and property they could, while the political framework that had organized their world dissolved around them.
Britain received no such accommodation. The island had been stripped of its legions in 407 when a usurper named Constantine led them to Gaul in pursuit of imperial ambitions. He failed. The legions never returned. Around 410, the same year Alaric entered Rome, the British provincials reportedly received a letter from Emperor Honorius telling them to look to their own defense. The imperial government had written off an entire diocese, acknowledging that it lacked the resources to protect territory across the Channel when it could barely protect Italy. Into the vacuum left by Roman withdrawal came the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes from the North Sea coasts of Germany and Denmark, first as raiders, then as settlers, then as conquerors. Within 2 generations, the Roman Britain of cities and villas and Latin literacy would become something unrecognizably different, its population pushed west into Wales and Cornwall or absorbed into the emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Western emperors of this era appear in the sources as ciphers, names attached to reigns of little consequence. Honorius died in 423, having spent his reign hiding in Ravenna while his empire disintegrated. His successors, Valentinian III, Petronius Maximus, Avitas, Majorian, Libius Severus, Anthemius, Olybrius, Glycerius, Julius Nepos, Romulus Augustulus, form a litany of failure spanning half a century. Some were children, some were puppets, some were murdered within months of their elevation. Real power in the Western Empire had passed to the master of soldiers, the military commander who controlled whatever forces remained and whose support was essential for any emperor to hold his position. These generalissimos were increasingly of barbarian origin or connection, men who understood the peoples pressing against the frontiers because they came from those peoples themselves. Flavius Aetius, who dominated Western politics from the late 420s until his death in 454, exemplified this new type of power broker. He had spent his youth as a hostage among both the Goths and the Huns, learning their languages and their methods, forming connections he would later exploit. He played the barbarian groups against each other with diplomatic skill that compensated for military weakness, using Hunnic mercenaries to check the Visigoths and the Burgundians, balancing threats rather than eliminating them. His strategy was not recovery, but management, holding together what could be held together for as long as possible.
The empire he served had neither the manpower nor the money to reconquer lost territories. It could only hope to prevent further losses and perhaps preserve some core of Roman authority for future generations to rebuild. The system Aetius managed was trapped in a spiral from which there was no escape. Lost territories meant lost revenues. Lost revenues meant smaller armies. Smaller armies meant more territories lost. Each year, the Western Empire controlled less land, collected less tax, fielded fewer soldiers. The barbarian peoples within and around its borders grew stronger in relative terms simply by remaining constant while Roman power declined. Aetius delayed the inevitable with skill and ruthlessness, but even he could not reverse the underlying mathematics of collapse. And now, from the east, a new force was gathering that would test whatever remained of Roman strength. The Huns, who had driven the Goths across the Danube 2 generations earlier, had consolidated under a single leader of unprecedented ambition. Attila was coming.
The Huns had haunted Roman consciousness for 3 generations before Attila united them into an instrument of conquest. They were the shadow behind every Gothic migration, the unseen pressure that had driven entire nations across the Danube and the Rhine, seeking refuge from something worse than Rome. But the Huns themselves had remained fragmented, their various groups serving as mercenaries for Roman and barbarian alike, their threat potential rather than actual. Attila changed this. Rising to sole leadership by 445 after murdering his brother and co-ruler Bleda, he forged the Hunnic tribes into a centralized empire stretching from the steppes of Central Asia to the borders of Gaul. For the first time, Rome faced not desperate migrants seeking accommodation, but a rival power seeking domination, led by a man whose ambitions acknowledged no limit and whose military capabilities exceeded anything the diminished empire could match alone. Attila was not the savage of later legend, though he cultivated an image of terrifying simplicity. Roman ambassadors who visited his court described a man of deliberate austerity surrounded by Gothic and Roman advisors, eating from wooden plates while his guests dined on silver, affecting the plainness of a steppe nomad while commanding the sophisticated machinery of imperial extortion. He understood Roman weakness with clinical precision. The Eastern Empire, wealthier but militarily overstretched, he milked through systematic intimidation. His raids into the Balkans in the 440s devastated cities that had survived every previous crisis, leaving ruins that would not be rebuilt for centuries. Constantinople itself was threatened, its famous walls the only barrier between the Hunnic horde and the richest city in the world. The Eastern Emperor Theodosius II purchased peace with tribute payments that eventually reached 2,000 pounds of gold annually, sums that strained even Constantinople's vast treasury. Attila took the gold, demanded more, and raided again when payment slowed. The Western Empire could not afford such tribute and could not survive such raids. Aetius, who had spent his career manipulating barbarian groups against each other, now faced the patron whose favor had made his career possible. He had used Hunnic mercenaries for decades to keep the Visigoths and Burgundians in check. Now the Huns themselves were coming, and the forces Aetius had balanced so carefully became his only hope of resistance. In 451, Attila crossed the Rhine with an army whose size the sources exaggerate into hundreds of thousands, but which was certainly the largest military force seen in Western Europe in generations. His immediate target was Gaul, the richest remaining territory of the Western Empire, and his path took him through cities that had known peace for centuries. Orleans was besieged. Lesser cities were destroyed so thoroughly that some never recovered their former names. The alliance that stopped Attila was as improbable as it was necessary.
Aetius rode to the Visigothic capital at Toulouse and convinced King Theodoric, whose people had fought Romans for generations and been fought by Hunnic mercenaries in Roman service, that the Hunnic threat transcended all previous enmities. The Visigoths joined the Roman cause not from love of Rome, but from recognition that Attila's victory would leave no room for Gothic kingdoms. Burgundians, Franks, and other peoples added their contingents to the coalition. For the first time since the great days of imperial expansion, a Roman general commanded an army drawn from nations that had been Rome's enemies, united by fear of something worse. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains, fought in June 451, somewhere in the Champagne country of northeastern Gaul, was one of the largest and bloodiest engagements of the ancient world. The sources offer contradictory accounts of its course, but certain elements emerge clearly. Theodoric, the Visigothic king, fell in the fighting, trampled in a cavalry charge, or struck down in the melee. His death might have shattered the alliance. Instead, his son, Thorismund, rallied the Visigoths to avenge their king. The fighting continued until nightfall left the field carpeted with dead from both sides. Attila, for the first time in his career, had been stopped. He withdrew across the Rhine, his army bloodied, though not destroyed, his aura of invincibility shattered. The victory at the Catalonian Plains did not end the Hunnic threat. The following year, Attila invaded Italy itself, crossing the Alps and descending into the Po Valley. Aquileia, the great fortress city guarding the northeastern approaches, was besieged and destroyed so completely that its survivors fled to the lagoons of the Adriatic and founded what would eventually become Venice. Milan was occupied. Other cities submitted or burned. The road to Rome lay open, and no army remained to bar it. What stopped Attila was not military resistance, but factors the sources struggled to explain. Famine and plague were ravaging Italy and reportedly spreading through the Hunnic camp. Supply lines stretched back across the Alps grew increasingly precarious. An Eastern Roman army threatened Hunnic territories beyond the Danube, and Pope Leo I rode north to meet Attila, conducting negotiations whose content was never recorded, but whose outcome was Hunnic withdrawal. Later legend attributed the retreat to miraculous intervention. The reality was probably more prosaic, a calculation that Italy's disease-ridden, famine-struck remnants were not worth the cost of taking them. Attila died in 453 on his wedding night to yet another wife, apparently from a hemorrhage aggravated by heavy drinking. He was perhaps in his late 40s. With his death, the Hunnic Empire that had terrorized 2 continents collapsed into fratricidal war among his sons, fragmented within a generation, and disappeared from history as suddenly as it had arisen. The peoples the Huns had dominated, Gepids, Ostrogoths, others, rose against their masters and shattered Hunnic power permanently. The existential threat had passed. But survival had cost the West almost everything it left. Aetius, the architect of resistance, did not long outlive his achievement. In September 454, Emperor Valentinian III, resentful of his generalissimo's power and suspicious of his intentions, personally stabbed Aetius to death during an audience at Ravenna. The emperor reportedly asked a courtier whether he had done well. The courtier replied that he could not say whether well or not, but he knew that Valentinian had cut off his right hand with his left. 6 months later, 2 of Aetius's former bodyguards assassinated Valentinian in turn. The Western Empire had survived the Huns, but the men who had made that survival possible were dead, and no one of comparable ability remained to face what the coming decades would bring.
The deaths of Aetius and Valentinian within 6 months of each other left the Western Empire without either effective military leadership or legitimate dynastic succession.
What followed was not dramatic collapse, but prolonged decomposition, a quarter-century of diminishing returns during which the imperial title passed through 9 hands, real power concentrated in barbarian generalissimos, and the territory under Roman control shrank until the empire consisted of little more than Italy itself. The viewer of this extended disintegration sees not sudden catastrophe, but the exhaustion of a system that had run out of the resources, the men, and perhaps the will to perpetuate itself. Each crisis was met with weaker responses than the last. Each recovery proved more partial than its predecessor. The end, when it finally came, would feel less like an event than a formality. The Vandal sack of Rome in 455 demonstrated how far imperial authority had deteriorated since even the Gothic sack of 45 years earlier. Petronius Maximus, an aristocrat who had arranged Valentinian's assassination and seized the throne in the chaos that followed, lasted 77 days. When news arrived that Gaiseric's Vandal fleet had sailed from Carthage and was approaching the Italian coast, Maximus attempted to flee Rome. A mob caught him outside the city walls, killed him, and threw his body into the Tiber. Pope Leo I, who had negotiated with Attila 4 years earlier, rode out again to meet the approaching barbarians. This time his intervention secured only limited concessions. Gaiseric agreed to spare the population and refrain from burning the city. He did not agree to spare its wealth. For 14 days, the Vandals systematically stripped Rome of everything portable that remained after the Gothic sack. They took the treasures of the imperial palace, the sacred vessels from churches, the accumulated wealth of senatorial families. They removed the gilded bronze roof tiles from the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, the holiest site in Roman civic religion. They took thousands of captives, including the Empress Eudoxia and her 2 daughters, one of whom would marry Gaiseric's son and provide the Vandals with a claim to imperial legitimacy. The ships that sailed back to Carthage carried the spoils of centuries, including, reportedly, the sacred objects Titus had seized from the Temple of Jerusalem 400 years earlier. Rome survived as a physical entity, but the city that had once commanded the world had now been plundered twice in a generation by peoples it had once dismissed as savages. The man who emerged from the chaos of 455 to dominate Western politics for the next 16 years was Ricimer, a general of mixed Visigothic and Suevian ancestry, whose barbarian blood disqualified him from wearing the purple himself, but whose control of whatever military forces remained made him the arbiter of who would wear it. Ricimer made and unmade emperors with the casualness of a man arranging furniture. Avitus, a Gallic aristocrat elevated with Visigothic support, lasted 16 months before Ricimer deposed him. Majorian, Ricimer's own candidate initially, showed unexpected independence and ambition that led to his execution in 1661. Libius Severus served as a compliant puppet for 4 years until his convenient death. Anthemius, imposed by the Eastern Empire in 667, lasted 5 years before Ricimer besieged Rome itself, captured the emperor he had supposedly served, and had him beheaded. Ricimer himself died of illness 40 days later, leaving behind a pattern of dysfunction that would persist until the end.
Majorian alone among these ephemeral figures attempted genuine restoration. He recognized that the Western Empire could not survive without North Africa, that the Vandal control of the grain supply and naval dominance of the Western Mediterranean made recovery impossible while Gaiseric lived. He spent 4 years rebuilding a fleet, gathering forces, and preparing an invasion to retake Carthage. The effort consumed nearly everything the diminished empire could muster.
In 461, the fleet assembled at Cartagena in Spain, 300 ships representing the West's last serious military enterprise. Vandal agents, reportedly warned by traitors, launched a surprise attack that destroyed most of the fleet before it could sail. The disaster ended any hope of African reconquest. Ricimer, who had opposed the ambitious campaign, had Majorian arrested, stripped of the purple, and executed 5 days later. The last emperor who might have reversed the empire's decline died not in battle against barbarians, but at the hands of his own generalissimo. The 2 decades between Majorian's death and the final deposition traced a trajectory of irreversible contraction. Gaul slipped away entirely, divided between Visigoths who controlled the south and west, Burgundians who held the Rhone valley, and Franks who dominated the north. Spain was similarly partitioned. North Africa remained firmly Vandal. Britain had been abandoned for half a century. The Rhine and Danube frontiers that generations of emperors had defended had become meaningless lines on maps that no longer corresponded to political reality. What remained was Italy and a theoretical claim to territories that barbarian kings ruled in practice. The emperors of these final years were shadows. Their authority extended little beyond the marshes surrounding Ravenna. Olybrius lasted 7 months in 472. Glycerius was deposed after a year by Julius Nepos, the Eastern Empire's candidate, who was himself driven from Italy by his own master of soldiers, Orestes, in 475. Orestes, a Roman who had once served as Attila's secretary, placed his own teenage son on the throne rather than claiming it himself. The boy's name was Romulus Augustus, though contemporaries called him Augustulus, the little Augustus, a diminutive that captured the pathetic reduction of imperial dignity from world-spanning power to a child's costume. The barbarian troops who theoretically defended Italy had watched this parade of puppet emperors with diminishing patience. They wanted what Gothic, Vandal, Burgundian, and Frankish warriors had received elsewhere: land of their own, permanent settlement, integration into the territories they supposedly served. When Orestes refused their demands, they found a leader willing to grant them. Odoacer was a Germanic officer of uncertain tribal origin who had served in the imperial forces and understood that the empire he served had become a hollow formality. His troops acclaimed him king. In August 476, they captured and executed Orestes near Pavia. The boy emperor Romulus was spared, pensioned off to a Campanian villa where he would live in obscurity for decades. The purple that had clothed Caesars for 5 centuries passed into the hands of a barbarian king who saw no need to maintain the pretense any longer.
The boy who surrendered the Western Empire was perhaps 16 years old, but the sources offer no certainty. His father, Orestes, had placed him on the throne less than a year earlier in an act of dynastic ambition that ignored the obvious reality that there was almost nothing left to rule. Romulus Augustus, Augustulus to those who found dark humor in the empire's diminishment, had never commanded armies, never negotiated with barbarian kings, never done anything that might qualify him for the position he nominally held. He was a symbol, a costume, a claim to legitimacy that his father hoped would provide cover for his own exercise of power. When Orestes fell, captured and executed by the Germanic troops whose demands for land he had refused, the boy was left alone in Ravenna with a title that no one any longer believed in and a future that depended entirely on the mercy of strangers. Odoacer entered the city in late August 476 with the authority of a man who understood that authority was simply what others would accept. He was Germanic, probably Syrian, though his exact tribal origins remained disputed. He had served in the Roman military system for years, rising through the same channels that had elevated Ricimer and Orestes and countless other barbarian officers to positions of power within an empire increasingly dependent on their swords.
What distinguished Odoacer from his predecessors was not ambition or ability, but clarity. He looked at the imperial office and saw what it had become, a fiction maintained for diplomatic convenience, a label applied to whoever the current strongman chose to prop up. The obvious question was why the fiction should be maintained at all. The meeting between Odoacer and Romulus Augustulus was almost certainly brief and entirely anticlimactic. No contemporary source records what words passed between them, if any. The imperial regalia, the purple robe, the diadem, whatever symbols of office still resided in Ravenna's palace, were gathered and packaged. Odoacer dispatched them to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno, along with a message that the West no longer required a separate emperor. Italy would henceforth be governed by Odoacer as Zeno's nominal representative, a legal fiction that preserved theoretical imperial unity while acknowledging practical barbarian control. Zeno, who had his own problems and no resources to spare for Italian adventures, acquiesced. The purple that had clothed rulers from Augustus to Romulus had returned to the city Constantine had founded, and it would not return to the West. What happened to Romulus himself reflected the strangely muted quality of the empire's end. Odoacer did not execute him. He did not imprison him, mutilate him in the ways that had become customary for deposed rulers in the Byzantine tradition developing in the East. He pensioned him. Romulus was sent to a villa in Campania, the Castellum Lucullanum near Naples, with an annual income of 6,000 solati, a comfortable sum by any standard, more than enough to maintain an aristocratic lifestyle for the remainder of his days. The last Western emperor lived out his life in comfortable obscurity, a teenager become historical footnote, his subsequent years so uneventful that the sources lose track of him entirely. A letter from 507 or 508 mentions a Romulus living in Campania who may be the former emperor. If so, he had survived 3 decades beyond his deposition, a private citizen in a world that had moved on without him. The quietness of the transition reflected a deeper truth that modern observers sometimes struggle to grasp. Contemporaries did not experience 476 as the apocalyptic end of civilization. The date that would later become a hinge of historical periodization, the dividing line between ancient and medieval, between classical antiquity and the Dark Ages, passed with barely a ripple in the contemporary sources. Chroniclers noted the change in rulers as they had noted so many others. The administrative machinery of the Italian state continued to function much as it had functioned under his imperial predecessors. Roman law remained in force. The Senate in Rome still met, still passed decrees, still provided a veneer of continuity with the Republican past. The great aristocratic families retained their estates and their social position. Churches celebrated Mass in Latin. Literacy persisted among the educated classes. The skills of Roman governance, tax collection, road maintenance, legal adjudication, transferred without obvious rupture to the new regime.
Yet something had ended, something that mattered beyond the mere change of personnel at the top of the Italian government. The Western Roman Empire had been more than an administrative structure. It had been an idea, a claim to universal authority that had organized Mediterranean civilization for 5 centuries. Emperors had risen and fallen, dynasties had come and gone, but the office itself had endured, providing a framework of legitimacy that transcended individual holders. When Odoacer sent the regalia to Constantinople and declined to name a new Western emperor, he was not merely changing governments, he was acknowledging that the framework itself had become meaningless. The Western Empire did not fall in 476. It had been falling for generations. What happened in Ravenna that summer was simply the formal recognition that the fall was complete. The Eastern Empire, of course, continued. Constantinople would stand for another 1,000 years, its emperors claiming unbroken succession from Augustus, its scholars preserving classical learning, its armies defending what remained of Roman territory in the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. From the Eastern perspective, there had been no fall at all, merely the loss of Western provinces that might someday be recovered.
Justinian would attempt exactly such a recovery in the following century, and for a time imperial forces would again occupy Rome, Ravenna, and parts of Italy. But these reconquests proved temporary and ruinously expensive. The West had become something else, a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms where Germanic warriors ruled over Roman populations, where Latin evolved into the Romance languages, where classical traditions blended with Germanic customs to produce the hybrid civilization of medieval Europe. The name of the last Western emperor carried an irony almost too perfect to be accidental. Romulus, the legendary founder who had given the city its name; Augustus, the title assumed by the first emperor who had transformed republic into empire. The founder and the founder united in a boy who presided over the end. Later historians would note the symmetry, finding in it the shape of tragedy. What Romulus had begun, Romulus ended. What Augustus had created, Augustulus surrendered. Whether contemporaries appreciated this poetry is unclear. What is clear is that the world Romulus Augustulus inherited had long since ceased to be the world his namesakes had known. The Mediterranean unity of the Augustan age had fractured into competing kingdoms. The legions that had conquered an empire had dissolved into barbarian war bands. The institutions that had governed 60 million people had contracted to the administration of a single peninsula. The boy who handed over the purple was surrendering not an empire, but a memory of one.
While the western provinces fragmented into barbarian kingdoms and the last emperor surrendered his meaningless title in Ravenna, the city Constantine had founded on the Bosphorus continued without interruption. Constantinople in 476 remained what it had been for a century and a half, the wealthiest, most populous, and most strategically situated city in the Mediterranean world. Its massive walls, constructed under Theodosius II in the early 5th century, had never been breached by foreign enemies and would not be for another 1,000 years. Its harbors connected the trade routes of 3 continents. Its treasury, replenished by taxes from the productive provinces of Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia, could still field armies and pay subsidies that the West had long since been unable to match. The Eastern Empire, that would later be called Byzantine, a term its inhabitants never used, always calling themselves Romans, was not a survivor of catastrophe, but a continuation of the same state that Augustus had founded 5 centuries earlier. The factors that differentiated East from West had been accumulating for generations before 476, and they operated across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Geography provided the most fundamental advantage. Constantinople sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, protected on 3 sides by water and on the 4th by walls that rendered it nearly impregnable to the siege technology of the age. An enemy approaching from the Balkans faced those legendary defenses. An enemy approaching from Anatolia had to cross the Bosphorus under the eyes of the imperial fleet. The Western Empire had no comparable fortress capital. Rome was indefensible, which is why emperors had abandoned it to Ravenna's marshes. Milan and Trier, the other Western imperial residences, fell to invaders repeatedly. Constantinople fell only twice in its 1,500-year history as a Roman and Byzantine capital, and the second time, in 1453, required artillery that could have been unimaginable to the generals of late antiquity. Economic advantages reinforced geographic ones. The eastern provinces had always been richer than the West, more urbanized, more monetized, more integrated into the long-distance trade networks that brought silk from China and spices from India. Egypt alone produced enough grain to feed Constantinople and generate surplus for export. Syria's cities manufactured textiles and glassware for markets across the known world. Anatolia provided both agricultural wealth and military manpower.
When the West lost Africa to the Vandals, it lost the revenues and grain supply upon which its survival depended. The East, with its economic base intact, could absorb comparable losses and continue functioning. The fiscal machinery that Diocletian had constructed worked better in territories where there was more wealth to tax and better infrastructure through which to collect it. The barbarian pressures that destroyed the West also struck the East, but with different timing and different outcomes. The Goths who crossed the Danube in 376 had initially been an Eastern problem. Adrianople was an Eastern catastrophe. But Theodosius I had managed the Gothic settlement, and his successors had managed to redirect Gothic ambitions westward, toward Alaric's eventual sack of Rome, rather than any assault on Constantinople. The Huns under Attila had extorted enormous tribute from the Eastern Empire and devastated the Balkans, but they had never breached the walls of the capital, and their empire collapsed with Attila's death. Later threats, Slavs, Avars, Persians, eventually Arabs, would test Constantinople severely, but the city endured each crisis and emerged with its essential structures intact. The Eastern Empire also developed more stable mechanisms for managing the succession crises that had done so much to destroy the West. This was not constitutionalism in any modern sense. Byzantine politics could be extraordinarily violent, with emperors regularly overthrown, blinded, or murdered by rivals. But the Eastern system developed conventions and institutions that channeled this violence more productively. The bureaucracy that administered the empire provided continuity across changes of ruler. The Church offered ideological legitimacy and sometimes served as a check on imperial excess. The people of Constantinople, organized into the blue and green circus factions, expressed political will through riots and acclamations that rulers ignored at their peril. These were not democratic institutions, but they were institutions, and they prevented any single point of failure from bringing down the entire system.
Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565, represented both the Eastern Empire's strength and the limits of what even that strength could accomplish. He was the last emperor to speak Latin as a first language, the last to seriously attempt the reconquest of the West, and the last to envision a restored Mediterranean empire united under a single Roman ruler. His generals, Belisarius and Narses, destroyed the Vandal kingdom in Africa and conquered Ostrogothic Italy in campaigns of brilliant military execution. For a moment, the map looked almost as it had 2 centuries earlier. Africa, Italy, parts of Spain, all of the East, again under imperial control. Justinian's law code, compiled from centuries of Roman legal tradition, would become the foundation of European jurisprudence for a millennium. His great church of Hagia Sophia, completed in 537, remained the largest enclosed space in the world for nearly 1,000 years, a statement in stone and gold of what Roman civilization could still achieve. Yet the reconquests proved ruinous victories. Italy was devastated by 20 years of warfare, its cities depopulated, its economy shattered more thoroughly than any barbarian invasion had managed. Holding the reconquered territories required resources the empire could not spare. Within 3 years of Justinian's death, the Lombards invaded Italy and seized most of what had been won at such terrible cost. Africa fell to the Arabs a century later. The Eastern Empire itself, exhausted by Justinian's ambitions, faced a Persian war that nearly destroyed it, and then the Arab conquests that stripped away Syria, Egypt, and North Africa permanently. What survived was a smaller, grimmer, more purely Greek state centered on Constantinople and Anatolia, still Roman in its own understanding, but no longer able to pretend that the Mediterranean unity of Augustus or even Constantine might be restored.
The story of the Eastern Empire's survival reframes the narrative of Rome's fall. There was no single moment when Roman civilization ended, no clean break between ancient and medieval. In the West, Roman institutions, Roman law, Roman Christianity, and the Latin language persisted under barbarian kings who often saw themselves as continuators rather than destroyers of the Roman tradition. In the East, the empire continued outright, evolving over centuries into something new, but never severing the thread of continuity that connected Justinian to Constantine to Augustus. What happened in 476 was not the fall of Roman civilization, but the fall of one particular political structure that had governed the Western Mediterranean. The civilization that structure had carried continued, transformed, fragmented, but recognizably descended from what Rome had built.
The question has haunted Western thought for 15 centuries. Why did Rome fall? Every generation has offered answers that reveal as much about the questioners as about the ancient world they interrogate. Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, blamed Christianity for sapping Romans' civic virtue and diverting the empire's best minds from public service to monastic contemplation. 19th century scholars saw racial degeneration, the dilution of pure Roman stock by inferior provincial blood. 20th century historians emphasized economic factors, military overextension, environmental catastrophe, or the contingent pressures of specific barbarian invasions. Each explanation captures something real while remaining incomplete, a partial truth mistaken for the whole. The fall of Rome was not a single event with a single cause, but a process of transformation spanning centuries, driven by multiple forces that reinforced and amplified each other until the structure could no longer bear their combined weight. Economic decline was real and measurable. The currency debasement that began under the Severans and accelerated through the 3rd century shattered confidence in the monetary system that had facilitated Mediterranean commerce. The disruption of trade networks, the contraction of cities, the retreat of population from exposed regions to fortified centers or rural estates, all of these trends are visible in the archaeological record. Tax revenues fell as the territories from which taxes could be collected shrank. The expense of maintaining armies sufficient to defend endless frontiers exceeded what the diminished economy could sustain. Yet economic decline was as much symptom as cause, the consequence of political instability and military disaster as much as their driver. Prosperous provinces did not generate weak armies. Weak armies failed to protect prosperous provinces, which then became poor. Military factors shaped every stage of the empire's decline. The Roman army that had conquered the Mediterranean was a citizen militia of Italian farmers serving short terms before returning to their fields. The army that defended the late empire was a professional force of career soldiers, increasingly recruited from the very barbarian peoples it was supposed to fight. This transformation was not corruption, but adaptation, a response to the reality that the empire's traditional manpower sources were exhausted, and that Germanic warriors made excellent soldiers when properly led and paid. The problem was that proper leadership and regular pay became increasingly difficult to provide. Civil wars consumed armies that should have defended frontiers. Soldiers who went unpaid transferred their loyalty to commanders who could promise better. The army that had created the empire became the mechanism of its destruction. Barbarian pressure was undeniable, but its significance requires careful interpretation. The Germanic peoples who crossed the Rhine and Danube in the 4th and 5th centuries were not savage destroyers intent on annihilating civilization. They were migrants seeking land, security, and integration into the Roman system that had dominated their world for generations.
Many of their leaders had served in Roman armies, spoke Latin, practiced Christianity, and aspired to Roman titles and honors. What they found was an empire too weak to defeat them, but too proud to accommodate them on terms they could accept. The resulting conflicts destroyed both the empire's military capacity and any possibility of orderly integration. Had Rome possessed the strength of the 2nd century, the migrations could have been managed as earlier movements had been. Had Rome possessed the flexibility to offer real partnership, the migrations might have strengthened rather than fragmented imperial power. Lacking both strength and flexibility, the empire fell between alternatives. Disease and climate change operated as silent amplifiers of every other pressure. The Antonine plague of the 2nd century and the plague of Cyprian in the 3rd killed millions and permanently reduced the empire's population. The late antique Little Ice Age, beginning in the 6th century, but perhaps preceded by earlier climatic disruptions, reduced agricultural yields across Europe and the Mediterranean. Fewer people meant fewer soldiers, fewer taxpayers, fewer farmers to work the land. Crop failures meant hunger, migration, and the breakdown of the complex social arrangements that prosperous societies maintain. These factors did not cause the fall of Rome in any simple sense, but they constrained the options available to those who might have prevented it, thinning the margins within which recovery remained possible.
Political dysfunction wove through every other failure. The absence of stable succession mechanisms meant that every transfer of power was potentially violent, and that capable emperors spent their reigns fighting rivals rather than governing effectively. The division of the empire between East and West, intended as administrative convenience, became permanent fracture as the two halves pursued competing interests and allowed each other to fail. The concentration of power in military strongmen of barbarian origin, Stilicho, Ricimer, Odoacer, reflected the reality that the traditional Roman aristocracy could no longer produce leaders capable of commanding armies or managing crises. The senators who had once governed provinces now managed estates, while Germanic kings made decisions of war and peace. No single factor explains Rome's fall, because no single factor operated in isolation. Economic decline weakened military capacity. Military failure reduced the territories from which economic resources could be extracted. Barbarian pressure exploited political divisions. Political dysfunction prevented coherent response to barbarian pressure. Plague reduced population. Reduced population meant fewer soldiers and less tax revenue. Smaller armies and constrained finances invited further invasion and internal conflict. The empire was a system of interlocking dependencies, and when multiple dependencies failed simultaneously, the structure collapsed. This was not inevitable. Different decisions at key moments might have produced different outcomes, but by the 5th century, the accumulation of failures had narrowed the range of possible futures to variations on fragmentation and transformation. What endured was more than wreckage. The Latin language evolved into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, carrying Roman concepts into cultures that had never known the legions. Roman law, codified by Justinian and transmitted through medieval universities, became the foundation of European legal systems. The Catholic Church, headquartered in Rome and organized on the model of Roman provincial administration, preserved literacy, learning, and institutional continuity through the darkest centuries. The idea of Rome, universal empire, civilizing mission, legitimate authority over diverse peoples, persisted through the Holy Roman Empire, through the Byzantine inheritance, through every European monarch who styled himself heir to the Caesars. We live in the world Rome made, and the world Rome's fall transformed.
the languages we speak, the laws we obey, the religions we practice, the very concept of Europe as a cultural unity, all trace their origins to the empire that rose on the banks of the Tiber and fell gradually and partially over centuries of struggle. Rome did not end in 476. Rome became something else, many things else, scattered across successor kingdoms and evolving institutions and persistent ideas. The fall was not an ending, but a metamorphosis, and its echoes shape our world still.